So if Photoshop is all about changing those squares, let me just do something really cool. I'm going to use my select, drag it around that house, and use a filter. So a lot of people, when they think of Photoshop, they're thinking of something like this, right? Or you can take a photograph and make it look more like a comic book or something. But if I zoom in, eventually I'm still going to see that it's just squares. Let's go ahead and open Illustrator and see what's different between Illustrator and Photoshop. Why, if I can change the color of squares in Photoshop, and I just said all screens are made up of squares, why do we need a different program for doing illustration versus editing a photograph? Well, in Illustrator, I'm going to create a new document. I'll just leave the settings that are there. So I just did File, New, left the settings that are there. And instead of using a pencil tool, which is there, if I use the pencil tool, I can draw. But it's not going to do what it did in Photoshop. The pencil tool is not the basic tool of Illustrator, as it is in Photoshop. It should be, we're going to have to go back an extra one. So hold up. That happens because Microsoft always wants to be open when Photoshop or any of those is, because they feel bad because they don't have cool enough design software. So we're going to go into Program Files, Adobe, and then there should be a folder for Illustrator, and on the PC, unfortunately, there are other stuff.
In Illustrator, I wanted to this up here, but my Photoshop stuff is still up.
So I have 2 to 3 minutes to show you what's different about Illustrator versus Photoshop. So I need everyone's attention. If I said that the paintbrush is the original core tool for Photoshop, I'm sorry, the pencil was what we started with. It evolves into the paintbrush, which is just a little bit smoother, but still painting with squares when you zoom in a lot. What's different about Illustrator? In Illustrator, rather than painting with a paintbrush, the essential tool in Illustrator is the pen. So everyone see if you can find the pen. It looks like a quill, like a, what do we call that kind of pen?
I can't remember.
I'm blanking out. Like a pen that you have to dip in ink.
Inkwell pen.
Inkwell pen, something, that'll work.
Fountain pen.
Fountain pen, sure. So I'm going to click on that pen tool. Now try drawing with the pen tool the way that you drew with the pencil in Photoshop and see what happens. Click. I'll do the same technique. I'm going to click with my left and paint with my, but wait a minute. If I click and, it's definitely not doing what I expected it to do. It's not really letting me intuitively paint with my finger the way that I could in Photoshop. Anyone notice that? What's it do? What happens when you click and drag? What happens when you click and try to draw something?
It curves the line.
Well, even before that, so let me go back. Yes, we end up with curves. So I select my pen tool, I click, and I drag. What's happening when I drag before anything even...
Stretching.
What's this? Yeah, 2 points with a line between them. And I can, no matter how far I go, I'm not really drawing anything. I just have these almost like handlebars. I'm going to let go, click somewhere else and drag, then I get a curve. A kind of funky curve. If I click again somewhere else and drag, I get another curve. Click again and drag, another curve. Click back to the origin point and drag, I actually get a shape. So if I deselect it, that is not what I expected. That is not a tool that you would be familiar with if you didn't do professional graphic design at some point, whether it's Flash or Illustrator. There's a similar tool in Photoshop that was eventually introduced. But let's try zooming in. So why don't you try clicking and dragging. So I'm going to click a point, click another point, drag, click another point, drag, click another point, drag, and eventually go back to that original point and click once to close it. Then I want to grab my magnifying glass and zoom in on my shape, on one area of my shape. So I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to zoom in. Illustrator lets me go to 6,400%. And what do you see at 6,400% on that line? Where are the pixels? Where are those little squares? In Photoshop, we could only zoom in 3,200%. In Illustrator, I can zoom in twice as far. But where are the pixels? No pixels. Core difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. Everything fundamentally in Photoshop, at least until a few years ago when they started adding all kinds of other stuff into it, but pretty much Photoshop is about changing the color of pixels, color of those tiny little squares, and making sure that you have a high enough resolution that you're zoomed out and you don't see the squares. You see a nice sharp image like my grandparents' house. Illustrator is totally different. What Illustrator is doing... No. Now we don't have time for rope. Bitmaps are gone. There's no bitmap in Illustrator. I'm not creating bitmaps in Illustrator. I'm not creating images out of little squares. I'm creating vector graphics. What's the difference between vector graphics and bitmap graphics? We saw one.
It's scalable.
Scalable. You can zoom into any amount. If you're doing a logo for Tasty Air, and you create it in Illustrator, you don't have to worry how big it's going to be eventually. If you want it on a billboard, no problem. You can use the same logo that you designed in Illustrator on a billboard or on your business card. It's going to be perfectly sharp. Why? Because what vector graphics are fundamentally is instructions on how to draw a curve. Not very exciting, right? What excites me is that this curve is mathematical instead of graphical. So that when you print this on a laser printer, you're actually giving instructions to the printer on how to draw a curve. That's kind of cool. Has anyone ever heard the term Postscript? A Postscript printer. Generally, what kinds of printers are described as Postscript? Inkjet or laser? Good guess. Laser printers. Laser printers actually have a head that moves inside. It's a laser that's being moved around. Anyone remember the original printers, which we called plotters, where you could actually see a pen moving around and drawing a shape? Because it's using math to describe the curve, that means that you can go all around that shape. It doesn't have to do what an inkjet printer does, which is this. Inkjet printer is printing every little square. What do we call those squares? I bought into it. No, points. I mentioned that one in passing, so I didn't expect anyone to get it. Pixels on a screen, points on a page. But have you ever noticed you're reading a book or a workbook or something and an image is really pixelated? It's fuzzy in the book. That's because somebody used Photoshop instead of Illustrator for that image. Or they took a photograph and the resolution was too low for the amount of points that you could put in a book. You can print higher, very high resolution on a page. Most people will start printing 300 dots per inch as opposed to what's our screen resolution on almost all screens in the world? 72 dots per inch. Certainly, you've had a photograph you've seen on a website, you tried to print it, it looks like crap. Sorry, I should be more articulate. Looks like crap when you print it, because the resolution doesn't match directly from the screen to the page. So Illustrator is going to let us do our logo. I'm going to zoom out here. The next most important tool in Illustrator, maybe the most important tool, is actually the type tool, the T. I'm going to click on the letter T, drag, and type the name of our company. Tasty Air. Change the point size to 60. Change the font to something pretty. Boost up that size even more. Now, because this is just a curve, watch what I can do with that curve. Let's say that we want some kind of funky shape for our logo. I could either try to redraw it, but did you notice how tricky it was to get the shape that you really wanted? You have to think ahead. Like, who thinks 2 or 3 curves ahead in a round shape? I don't. I've been doing this for a long time. But if I click on my fountain pen, it's just called the pen tool, I have other options, which I know from my little triangle, and I'm going to go to Convert Anchor Point tool. It's a very interesting tool. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can really see what this does. Convert Anchor Point. I'm going to click anywhere on my path. We call it a path because it's instructions as opposed to an actual shape. So I'm going to click. Let's find an anchor point. How about, let's cheat. Let's do this. Let's select. What's that?
It's under the A. There is an anchor point.
Under here. Thank you. Yeah, I can't see at this resolution. So that point, anyone see what happened when I clicked on the actual anchor point? I'm going to undo it. So what Daniel noticed is when I mouse over it, it's showing me where each of the points where I originally clicked are. They're called anchor points. They're the anchor that holds that shape together. So if I just click on that point with convert, watch what happens. Click. What did it do? Went from this to this. We won't worry about the terminology right now, but it changed the shape. I'm going to undo that. Instead of just clicking, I'm going to click and drag. And what's it doing now? How would we refer to that? Let's actually make it a solid color to really make it obvious what it's doing. What am I doing? I'm grabbing one end of that handlebar. I don't think of that as drawing. I think of it as sculpting. I'm actually taking this shape as if it was a piece of clay or the wire that you have on your desk. And I'm actually changing the shape of that with those handlebars, or what we call control points. I'm going to change the color. I'm just double-clicking on that black. I want to get a nice dark red, which I'm really partial to. And I'm going to reshape it until it sort of gives me a feel of some kind of graphic. And we're totally out of time, so I'm not going to get too fancy with this, but let's just pretend I spent a few more minutes. Yeah, if I had a little more time, I think what I would do is actually add some more points, some more of those anchor points, and just move them around a bit to give us something that looks a little more like a cloud, maybe. Get the general idea? But if I zoom in as far as I want, it's always going to be perfectly sharp. That's Illustrator as opposed to Photoshop.